right, welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology here with your professor, Dr. Sean Clavel. And this is chapter 2 as we continue through the organic molecules. In the previous section, we talked about carbohydrates, and in this section, we'll talk about lipids or fats, right? So, lipids are a diverse group of organic molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. Now, lipids are nonpolar substances and they're insoluble in water. The main chemical difference between lipids and the carbohydrates that we talked about previously is that lipids don't follow this 1-2-1 pattern that we saw with carbohydrates, right? One carbon to two hydrogen to one oxygen. Actually, lipids contain much less oxygen compared to carbohydrates. And so lipids can also contain other substances like phosphorus, nitrogen, or sulfur. Examples of lipids are fats, oils, and waxes in our bodies. Primarily, we'll be talking about triglycerides, right? The glycerides, phospholipids, which make up the cell membrane, and then cholesterols and steroids. But that'll be in future sections here where we talk about that structures. But primarily, triglycerides and phospholipids are going to be the main categories of lipids that we'll be talking about in this section. Now, lipids have a number of important functions in the body. They are an essential component to all of our cells, and they function as chemical messengers. They are a reserve energy supply. They provide twice as much energy as carbohydrates. So while we utilize carbohydrates as a fuel more readily, fats are a more robust energy supply, but they can also provide structural support, right? They provide parts of the body, including the underlying tissue to attach to, the skin to attach to the underlying tissue, and this adipose tissue provides protection as well as insulation. Now, the first group of lipids we're going to talk about is the fatty acids. Fatty acids are these long chains that are attached with these long chains of carbon that are attached to hydrogen atoms. So you can see there's a hydrocarbon chain that we're seeing here on the bottom of our screen in this fatty acid. And then there's a carboxylic acid group here at the top of it or at the head. So the head here is hydrophilic, meaning that it will interact with water, meaning water loving. And the tail is hydrophobic, meaning that it is water fearing or doesn't interact with water. And fatty acids can be either saturated or unsaturated. A saturated fatty acid has no double bonds between the carbons of the fatty acid. That means the acid has the maximum amount of hydrogen atoms. These saturated, oh, excuse me, let me go back. Let me try that again. These saturated fatty acids are generally solid animal fats like butter, saturated fats, uh, and excuse me, unsaturated fatty acids generally are liquid at room temperature and they have one or more double bonds. You can see that there at the bottom there, where there's a double bond between the carbon atoms, and as a result, it gives it this shape of like a twist or a kinked shape. These are plant oils like olive oil. These are unsaturated fatty acids. Another type of lipid is the glyceride. Now, one or more fatty acid chains that are attached to a glycerol. So, a glycerol is a functional group to the head here, and it attaches to this fatty acid chain. So, a fatty acid chain here attaches to the glycerol, and we get what's known as a glyceride. So there's different types of glycerides. Monoglycerides is one fatty acid attached to a glyceride, a glycerol backbone, a diglyceride, two fatty acids attached. And so the most common dietary lipids is the triglyceride, and it's found most abundantly in our body tissues. This is what's commonly referred to as fat. It's formed from the synthesis of two types of molecules. First, there's a glycerol backbone at the core of the triglycerides, which consists of three carbon atoms. Then there's three fatty acid, long chains of hydrocarbons with a carboxyl group and a methyl group at opposite ends. So you've got the carboxyl group at one end, you've got the methyl group at the other, methyl group at the other. And finally, triglycerides are formed by dehydration synthesis. So the glycerol gives up a hydrogen atom while its hydroxyl group from its hydroxyl group, and the carboxyl group gives up the hydroxyl. So you can see there's a hydrogen atom from the hydroxyl group of the glycerol, as well as a hydroxyl group that's released from the carboxyl group of the fatty acid. And this is, again, a triglyceride, the most common dietary lipid. And the final lipid that we'll talk about here is the phospholipid and glycolipid, but primarily the phospholipid. Uh, they're kind of a modified triglyceride. They contain two fatty acid chains. And then at the head of this glycerol backbone, what you have is a phosphate containing polar head here. So this actually allows us to, this phosphate head interacts with water. The fatty acid chains, which are non-polar, are hydrophobic, and the head and the tail regions have different properties, which are important to in cell membrane structure. So remember, the phospholipids have a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. And I'll show you the last one here. Let's talk about one more. Maybe let's talk about the steroids. Steroids are four ring structures. Are interlocking four ring structures. They contain four interlocking hydrocarbon rings that form a steroid. Cholesterol is the basis for all steroids, and they're formed in the body. And it is a component that gives uh, integrity or stability to the cell membranes. And so that wraps up our section here on lipids. Stay tuned in our next portions where we'll talk about proteins and finally nucleic acids, the rest of the organic molecules.